Elijah Voss, a weathered veteran, is invited to the Valor Night Gala but is dismissed by a hostess who mistakes his humble appearance for insignificance. Escorted out into the rain, he stands silently, unnoticed by the glittering crowd inside. A janitor, Carlos Medina, recognizes him and alerts authorities. General Braxton arrives, halts the gala, and demands Elijah's reinstatement, revealing his heroic past. Elijah's quiet dignity sparks a reckoning, exposing the gala's shallow honor. His speech challenges the audience to see beyond appearances, leaving a lingering question. Who else is overlooked, and what truths remain unseen? If Elijah's story touched you, join us in honoring quiet heroes. Like, subscribe, and share to spread this powerful message. Comment your own experiences of overlooked dignity. Support our channel to uncover more inspiring stories. Together, let's see beyond the surface and celebrate true worth. Thank you. The rain hung heavy in the air, a restless promise of the storm to come, as Elijah Voss stood just beyond the glowing warmth of the Belmont Grand Hotel. His olive drab field jacket, worn thin at the elbows and creased with the weight of years, seemed out of place against the hotel's polished grandeur. The cold nipped at his knuckles, but he stood with hands loose at his sides, his posture rigid with a discipline carved deep by decades of service. His boots, polished to a muted gleam, bore the faint scars of countless miles, through deserts, jungles, and moments no one inside this glittering palace could fathom. He didn't belong here, not among the clinking glasses and rehearsed smiles, but the invitation tucked in his pocket, heavy with its gold-embossed seal, had summoned him nonetheless. Days earlier, the envelope had arrived, unassuming among the clutter of pharmacy ads and utility bills that piled up by his door. Its texture was rich, almost alien to his work-worn hands, and the letterhead, Valor Night Gala, Belmont Grand Hotel, felt like a dispatch from a life he'd left behind. The handwritten note inside stirred something in him. Mr. Voss, we are honored to invite you as a distinguished guest in recognition of your lifelong service. Your presence would mean the world to us. He'd read it twice, his weathered brow creasing, the words tugging at memories he rarely allowed himself to touch. Distinguished? The word felt hollow. He recalled the last time it was used, a VA clerk's saccharine smile as she slid a benefits denial across a desk. Galas weren't his world. They were loud, fleeting things, full of people who spoke of sacrifice without knowing its weight. But he thought of the men who didn't come home, their names etched in stone or carried in his silence. For them, he'd go. He'd dressed with quiet intention, not for himself, but for those he honored. The khakis were pressed crisp, the collared shirt faded at the shoulders but clean, the boots polished as best he could manage. Over it all, he wore the field jacket, its threads worn, its creases a map of fire, dust, and loss. No medals adorned it, he'd never needed them. The jacket spoke for itself, a quiet testament to a life of service. He'd walked into the Belmont Grand alone, invitation in hand, his steps steady but unassuming. The hotel was a spectacle, marble floors gleaming under chandeliers that scattered light like stars, valet drivers moving with mechanical grace in their black gloves. No one noticed him. No heads turned, no cameras flashed. He didn't expect them to. Elijah had always moved through the world like a shadow, unnoticed but ever present. At the VIP lounge entrance, a young woman in a tailored blazer glanced up from her tablet. Her eyes swept over him, jacket, boots, the deep lines of his face, and dismissed him in an instant. "Sir," she said, her voice sharp and polished, "this area is reserved for confirmed VIP guests." Elijah held up the invitation, its gold seal glinting faintly. She barely looked at it, her lips curving into a smile that was all surface, no soul. "This must be a mistake. The VIP list is curated. Perhaps you're looking for the lobby seating area." Her tone carried no malice, only a cool, practiced condescension, honed by privilege and training. It was the smile of someone who'd already closed the door in her mind, who judged him unworthy without a second thought. Elijah felt a familiar ache, not anger, but the quiet recognition of being unseen. He'd faced this before, in sterile offices and war-torn outposts, where his sacrifices were reduced to a glance or a form. He didn't argue, he didn't recount the battles he'd fought or the lives he'd carried. He gave her a single nod, folded the invitation back into its envelope, and stepped away. The rejection didn't rattle him. He'd known worse. In Kandahar, a doorman's daughter had once pressed a warm sandwich into his hands, her eyes alight with a kindness that cut through the chaos of war. That moment, fleeting and uncelebrated, held more weight than any gilded guest list. Elijah moved past the glittering crowd, their laughter and clinking glasses a distant hum. He stopped by the lobby doors, standing calmly as the first whispers of rain brushed the glass. He didn't fidget or sigh. He simply waited, his presence as steady as it had been in foxholes or under fire. Outside, the cold breeze curled around him, but he stood unmoved, a man who'd long ago learned to endure. Inside, the gala unfolded in a haze of self-congratulation. Glasses were raised to heroes, speeches rang with grand words, but no one noticed the empty seat at the VIP table. Elijah didn't think of it either. He thought of the men he'd lost, their faces vivid in his mind, sharper than the strangers around him. He thought of their dog tags, heavy in his hands, the letters he'd written to their families, the promises he'd kept in silence. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, streaking the hotel's grand windows. He didn't move. Then came the tap on his shoulder. A security guard, young and broad, his face a mask of professionalism, spoke in a low, firm tone. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Elijah turned, meeting the guard's eyes without defiance or fear. He'd faced worse than this, too. He nodded, ready to follow, when the growl of tires tore through the night. 3 black SUVs screeched to a halt at the hotel's entrance, their doors flying open. A 4-star general emerged, his presence a force even in the rain. His eyes swept the crowd, sharp and unyielding, before locking on the empty chair inside. He pointed, his voice slicing through the gala's murmur. "Where is the man you just threw out?" The room fell silent. Faces paled, glasses froze midair. The general's next words were a quiet blade, cutting deep. "Pack your things. You're done." Elijah Voss moved toward the lounge, his steps deliberate, each one carrying the weight of a man who had walked through too many shadowed places to rush now. The young hostess, perched behind her sleek desk, had already turned back to her tablet, her face a mask of indifference, as if she'd dismissed him long before he'd even approached. Her fingers danced across the screen, a silent verdict rendered without a glance. Elijah reached into the worn pocket of his field jacket, the fabric frayed at the edges but still sturdy, and pulled out the envelope. Inside, the invitation lay pristine, its sharp creases a testament to the care he'd taken to preserve it. He handed it to the guard, a broad-shouldered man, whose eyes barely flickered as he took it. The guard didn't bother to open it, didn't even unfold the flap. "Ma'am says you don't have clearance," Vahis said, his voice flat, mechanical. "I'm just doing my job." That phrase, "just doing my job," hit Elijah like a dull blade. He'd heard it before, too many times. From border guards who turned away desperate families, their faces etched with resignation. From embassy clerks who shuffled papers and denied visas with a practiced flick of the wrist. From young officers, barely old enough to shave, who'd never known the weight of a rifle but could sign a rejection form with the precision of a sniper. It was a phrase that carried no malice, only apathy, and somehow that made it worse. Elijah nodded, a small, controlled motion, and took the envelope back. He said nothing. Words wouldn't change the outcome. He followed the guard's gesture toward the exit, his boots steady on the polished marble floor. They didn't drag him out. That would have been messy, and this place, the Belmont Grand, was nothing if not meticulous. No, they escorted him with a quiet efficiency, a professional courtesy that stung more than a shove ever could. It was a dismissal dressed in civility, a reminder that he didn't belong in their world of gilded elegance. The hotel lobby glowed with manufactured opulence, all warm light and gleaming surfaces, a stage set for people who belonged. The chandeliers cast soft halos on the walls, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and wealth. But to Elijah, it felt like a museum, beautiful, cold, and utterly indifferent to a man like him, a man whose hands bore the calluses of survival, whose eyes carried memories no one in this place could ever understand. He stepped through the grand double doors into the evening, the heavy panels closing behind him with a whisper of finality, like the ceiling of a tomb. Outside, the air was sharp, a cold that bit at his knuckles and settled into his bones. A fine mist of rain hung in the air, just enough to cling to the shoulders of his jacket, darkening the fabric in uneven patches. He stood still, not out of indecision, but because that was his way. In the field, movement without purpose was a death sentence. Here, in the shadow of the Belmont Grand, it simply made you invisible. Guests hurried past, their eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the scenery, a lamppost, a doorman, or just another stranger who didn't fit the narrative of their evening. Some cast awkward glances, unsure if he was hotel staff or a lost soul who'd wandered too close to their polished world. His presence was an anomaly, a crack in the facade of the gala within, where tailored suits and silver spoons gleamed under the weight of their own importance. But then, someone noticed him. A janitor, no older than his late 20s, was pushing a floor buffer along the edge of the lobby's massive windows. The machine hummed softly, a steady drone beneath the murmur of the crowd inside. The young man paused, his hand stilling on the handle as his eyes met Elijah's. There was something in the way the old man stood, weight-centered, spine straight, not defensive, but ready, like a sentinel who'd stood watch through countless nights. It was a posture the janitor recognized, though he couldn't say why. A flicker of something, memory, instinct, crossed his face and his breath caught in his throat. He stepped away from the buffer, moving closer to the glass, wiping it with a towel as if to clear his view, to be certain of what he saw. Elijah caught the glance but held his silence. He offered only a nod, the same understated gesture he'd given to soldiers in dusty outposts, to villagers huddled in the ruins of their homes, to medics stitching wounds under fire, to children clutching scraps of hope in alleyways. It was a nod that said, "I see you and you see me." The janitor hesitated, then pulled out his phone. His fingers moved quickly, dialing a number as he turned slightly, shielding the call from the world. His voice was low, urgent, barely above a whisper. "Yeah, it's him. He's here, standing outside. No, he hasn't said a word." He hung up, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and returned to his buffer. The machine's hum swallowing the moment as if it had never happened. But Elijah saw it all, felt the weight of that fleeting connection, a spark in the cold. He remained by the entrance, unmoving as the rain thickened, turning mist into a steady drizzle that slicked the sidewalks and seeped into the seams of his jacket. The world around him blurred, the city's lights smearing into soft halos, but he didn't shift. He wasn't waiting for permission or an invitation. He'd already been denied those. He was waiting because of a promise, one carved into the marrow of his bones. Men like Elijah didn't break promises. They didn't leave early, didn't falter, didn't walk away until the mission was done. Even if the mission was as simple as standing in the rain, bearing witness to a world that had forgotten him. Inside the Belmont Grand, the ballroom was a vision of excess. Chandeliers spilled golden light across polished wood floors, their glow reflected in the sheen of white linen tables. Men in bespoke suits and women in gowns draped with pearls moved through the space, their laughter and clinking glasses a symphony of privilege. At the podium, a senator leaned into the microphone, his voice heavy with rehearsed solemnity. "Tonight we gather to honor the heroes who gave this country their strength, their youth, their lives. We celebrate the brave, the loyal, the few." The applause that followed was crisp, measured, as if it had been choreographed to match the elegance of the room. It was a performance, polished and perfect, and it rang hollow to anyone who knew the cost of the words being spoken. Just 30 feet away, Elijah Voss stood in the rain, unnoticed, forgotten. Each drop traced a path down his weathered face, carving lines through the dust of a life spent in service. He didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't check his watch. If the cold seeped into him, he gave no sign. His hands remained folded in front of him, calm and steady, the way soldiers stood during memorial roll calls, honoring the fallen with their presence. To Elijah, this moment was no different. He stood as if bearing witness to something sacred, something the people inside would never understand. The rain fell harder, soaking him through, but he remained, a sentinel in the dark, holding his ground for a promise no one else remembered. In the opulent glow of the Belmont Grand Hotel's chandelier-lit lobby, a defense contractor flashed a practiced smile for a photograph, his arms slung casually around a congressman's shoulder. Their conversation buzzed with lofty words: service, sacrifice, honor, tossed around like polished coins, gleaming but weightless. Neither had ever tasted the dust of a battlefield or felt the sting of loss that lingers long after the guns fall silent. Their world was one of handshakes and champagne flutes, far removed from the scars of war. At the edge of the hallway, hidden behind a service cart piled high with silverware trays, Carlos Medina stood watching. His eyes, sharp and haunted, peered through the foggy glass doors. At 29, Carlos was no stranger to the weight of memory. 2 tours in Afghanistan had left him with more than just a limp from a roadside blast that shattered his military career. It had stripped away his illusions about how the world treated veterans, men and women who returned home to be forgotten, swept aside like dust under the rug. Now he swept floors, his presence as invisible as the grime he scrubbed away. But tonight, something stirred in him, a flicker of recognition that burned brighter than the polished marble under his feet. Carlos paced, his heart thudding against his ribs. His mind wasn't on the buffer he'd abandoned in the utility closet. It was a decade ago, in the chaos of Kandahar, where a collapsed housing unit had trapped men in a tomb of rubble and fire. The screams still echoed in his dreams, raw and desperate, mingling with the choking dust. But one image stood out, vivid and unshakable. A broad-shouldered soldier, eyes calm amidst the storm, dragging men out one by one. Dust-covered, relentless, he moved with a purpose that defied the chaos. That soldier was no ordinary man. He was the kind you never forgot, the kind whose courage carved itself into your soul. Now, through the rain-streaked glass, Carlos saw him again. Elijah Voss, standing alone outside, his field jacket heavy with rain and the weight of memory. Carlos's breath caught, his fingers trembling as he fumbled for his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't touched in years, one tied to a past he rarely revisited. The line rang once before a voice answered, steady and expectant. "He's here," Carlos said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. Elijah Voss standing out front. They threw him out like he was nothing. The line went quiet for a heartbeat, the silence heavy with unspoken understanding. "Understood," came the reply, clipped and final. The call ended and Carlos slipped the phone back into his pocket. He stepped away from the window, his chest tight with a mix of awe and restraint. He didn't go outside, didn't want to disturb the man who stood like a monument in the rain. Some men, Carlos thought, deserved to be seen for exactly who they were. Not pitied, not fixed, just witnessed in their quiet, unyielding strength. Outside, Elijah Voss stood motionless, rain streaming down his weathered face. His field jacket clung to his frame, soaked through, but he didn't flinch. The cold didn't touch him, not the way memory did. He wasn't angry at being turned away from the hotel's gilded doors, nor was he surprised. Recognition was a currency he'd long stopped expecting. The world had moved on, but Elijah hadn't. For him, the mission never ended. It was woven into his bones, a vow he carried through every sleepless night. Tonight, though, it was personal. Something stirred in the air, a reckoning waiting to unfold. The night was sliced open by the growl of engines. 3 matte black SUVs roared up to the curb outside the Belmont Grand, tires screeching as they scattered rainwater in a sharp spray across the street. Their tinted windows and armored bodies screamed authority, their movements precise, almost surgical. Valets scrambled, their polished shoes slipping on the wet pavement, while the doorman stiffened, his hand hovering uncertainly over his radio. The first SUV's door swung open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his military dress uniform crisp despite the rain. The ribbons on his chest gleamed under the streetlights, and the 4 silver stars on his shoulders caught the light like sparks of fire. General Lawrence Braxton didn't walk. He advanced, as if the pavement itself parted for him. There was no hesitation in his stride, no glance for the curious onlookers. The rain didn't dare cling to him. It fell away as if it knew better. Inside the hotel, the air shifted as General Braxton pushed through the glass doors, the cold trailing him like a shadow. His boots struck the marble floor with a rhythm that demanded attention, each step echoing like a gavel. Guests turned, their chatter faltering. Security guards exchanged glances, one reaching for his radio before thinking better of it. Braxton's eyes scanned the room, sharp and unyielding, like radar locking onto a target. They settled on the VIP lounge, where a single empty chair stood out amid the sea of clinking glasses and forced laughter. The untouched champagne flutes seemed to mock the absence of the man who should have been there. His voice cut through the room like a blade. "Where is the man you just threw out?" The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that silenced the crowd. Laughter died. Wine glasses froze midair. The young hostess who had dismissed Elijah earlier blinked, her face pale as if waking from a dream. "I'm sorry, General," she stammered, her voice trembling under the weight of his presence. "I was told he wasn't cleared. He didn't look like—" Braxton's expression hardened, a masterclass in controlled fury. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Didn't look like what?" His tone was a scalpel, precise and cutting. "Didn't look like he was wearing a $1,000 suit and a charity pin?" The hostess faltered, her words crumbling under his gaze. "We didn't know who he was," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Braxton's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous edge. "That's the problem," he snapped. "You didn't ask." An assistant event coordinator, his gold badge gleaming on his tailored suit, stepped forward, trying to diffuse the tension. But Braxton's focus was unrelenting, his mission clear. The room held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The air in the hotel lounge was thick with the hum of self-important chatter, clinking glasses, and the faint rustle of expensive fabric. General Lawrence Braxton stood at the edge of the gala, his dress uniform crisp, his jaw set like a man who had seen too many promises broken to trust the polished smiles around him. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the room, not for the corporate sponsors or the senator nursing a scotch in the corner, but for one man who should have been there, Sergeant Major Elijah Voss. The absence of that name, that presence, gnawed at Braxton's chest like a wound that refused to heal. This event, draped in the pretense of honoring veterans, felt like a mockery without Voss, a betrayal. He turned to the young hostess who had approached him moments earlier, her nervous smile faltering under his gaze. "Sir, if there's been some misunderstanding," she began, her voice trembling with the weight of protocol. Braxton cut her off, his voice low but carrying the force of a storm. "This entire gala is the misunderstanding. If Elijah Voss isn't inside this hotel, then neither am I. And if I'm not here, the Pentagon's funding walks out with me." A gasp rippled through the crowd, sharp and involuntary, like a glass dropped in a quiet room. Faces paled, corporate sponsors clutching their drinks a little tighter, their eyes darting toward one another as if searching for someone to blame. The head of security, a burly man who had hovered awkwardly nearby, froze, unsure whether to step closer or retreat. Braxton didn't care. He didn't wait for their permission or their platitudes. He pulled his phone from his pocket, pressed a contact, and spoke with the kind of finality that left no room for negotiation. "Pull the funding. We're relocating the event. All of it." The words landed like a grenade, and the room seemed to hold its breath. From the hallway, the hotel manager, Ty Skew, emerged, his face flushed with panic, his tie slightly askew as though he'd been running. "General Braxton, sir, please," he said, his voice straining to balance deference and desperation. "Let's not escalate this." Braxton's head snapped toward him, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Escalate," he said, the word dripping with disdain. "You don't get to honor veterans with one hand while tossing them into the rain with the other." He turned to the hostess and the security chief, who stood like statues caught in the wrong moment. "As for you two," he said, his voice slicing through the tension, "pack your things. You're done." The silence that followed was deafening, a void so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Somewhere in the room, a champagne flute slipped from someone's hand, cracking against the tile floor with a sound that felt like the breaking of something larger. No one cheered. No one clapped. This wasn't a performance. This was a reckoning, raw and unscripted, and it stripped the room of its veneer. At the far end of the lounge, a senator set his glass down slowly, his brow furrowed as he processed the weight of what had just unfolded. A hedge fund executive leaned toward his aide, whispering something urgent, his face tight with unease. Even the event's MC, who had been poised mid-stage to introduce the next speaker, lowered the microphone and stepped back, his rehearsed charisma replaced by a quiet acknowledgement that this moment was bigger than him. For the first time all evening, the room's attention wasn't on the podium, the donors, or the glittering wall of names behind the bar. It was on an empty chair, a symbol of absence, and the man who had come to demand it be filled. Outside, the rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the hotel's double doors. They creaked open again, this time pushed from within. Taisku stumbled out, his suit damp, his tie now completely undone, hanging like a noose around his neck. Sweat glistened on his brow, and his eyes were wide with the kind of desperation that comes from knowing you've miscalculated badly. "Elijah Voss," he called into the storm, his voice cracking with a mix of urgency and repentance. "Sir, please. General Braxton is asking for you." Elijah Voss stood just beyond the awning, his silhouette blurred by the rain. He hadn't moved much in the last hour, his soaked jacket clinging to his frame like a second skin, his boots planted in a puddle that reflected the hotel's garish lights. The cold had seeped into his bones, but it was nothing compared to the weight of being forgotten, of being pushed aside by the very people who claimed to honor him. His heart was a quiet furnace, burning with a mix of resignation and pride. He didn't want their pity or their spectacle. He had come because he'd been invited, because he believed, for a fleeting moment, that his service still mattered. Now, as he turned slowly to face the manager, something in him stirred, not grandly, not with fanfare, but with the steady resolve of a man who had carried heavier burdens than this. He straightened his shoulders, the motion deliberate, and stepped forward. The rain slid down his face, but his eyes were clear, fixed on the manager with a gaze that seemed to see through him. "I don't want to cause trouble," Elijah said, his voice steady, the kind of quiet that forces others to hear. The manager shook his head, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Sir, with all respect, the trouble's already here. The general says the event won't go on unless you're treated as the guest you were meant to be." Elijah studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity in the man's frantic expression. Then with a single nod, he stepped toward the doors. There was no drama in his stride, no flourish, just a calm that seemed to unsettle the air around him. His boots left faint, wet prints on the tile floor as he crossed the threshold. Each step a reminder of the world he'd been forced to stand in alone in. Inside, the lounge was a sea of faces, some curious, some confused, others tinged with shame. A few guests near the lobby glanced up from their drinks, their brows knitted as they tried to place him. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd, slow at first, like the first drops of a coming storm. "Is that him?" someone murmured. Another leaned toward a friend, voice low. "Didn't he?" But the name hadn't reached them yet, not until General Braxton stepped forward. In the center of the room, under the soft glow of the chandelier, Braxton went to attention, standing tall. His spine snapped back straight up, his heels clicked together, and together, without a single word, he raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute. The gesture was precise, heavy with respect and something deeper. Regret, maybe regret, for the oversight that had led to this moment. Elijah returned the salute, his own movements quiet but firm, deliberate, his eyes locked on Braxton's. In that single moment, no words were needed. It was a language of duty, of shared sacrifice, and it carried louder than any speech could have. The murmurs grew louder now, spreading like wildfire. More heads turned, guests rising from their feet, chairs scraping softly against the floor. Some reached for their phones, not to capture a moment for likes, but to hold on to a moment that felt sacred, something real. This wasn't the gala they'd expected. It was something heavier, truer. And at its heart stood two men, one who had come to right a wrong, and another who had never asked for the fight, but would not turn away from it. The grand ballroom buzzed with the clink of wine glasses and the hum of polite conversation, a sea of tuxedos and glittering gowns swaying under the glow of crystal chandeliers. The air carried the faint scent of expensive perfume and ambition, the kind of atmosphere cultivated at high-profile fundraisers where wealth and influence mingled effortlessly. Yet beneath the polished surface, an undercurrent of unease began to stir. Subtle at first, like a breeze rustling through a still forest. Guests turned their heads, their murmurs growing from a faint whisper to a rolling wave, as though the room itself sensed the arrival of something, or someone, far greater than the evening's carefully scripted agenda. General Braxton strode through the towering double doors, his presence slicing through the crowd with the precision of a blade. His broad shoulders were squared, his steps deliberate, each one radiating a quiet authority that demanded attention without a single word. Behind him, moving with a steadier gait despite the damp olive jacket clinging to his frame, was Elijah Voss. No medals adorned his chest, no dress uniform announced his status. Just a man, unassuming, his face weathered by time and trials, his eyes carrying a depth that seemed to hold entire battlefields within them. The rain had left his jacket streaked, but it was his silence, resolute, unyielding, that spoke louder than any fanfare could. It was as if the room itself paused to catch its breath, the weight of his presence shifting the very air. The hotel manager trailed behind, his polished shoes scuffing against the marble floor as he scrambled to keep pace. His face was flushed, a sheen of sweat betraying his nerves as he wrung his hands. "General, if I may," he stammered, his voice thin and trembling. "I assure you, we had no idea who he was. There was no profile submitted, no confirmation, nothing in the system." His words tumbled out in a desperate bid to explain the inexplicable, to justify why a man like Elijah Voss had been turned away at the door, left to stand in the rain like a stranger. But Braxton didn't break stride. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was low and unyielding, like the clang of a steel door sealing shut. "You don't need a biography to recognize dignity. You don't need a resume to treat a man with respect." He paused, turning just enough to pin the manager with a stare that cut through the excuses like a laser. "You need eyes. You need humility. Clearly, this establishment has neither." The manager froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words came. The rebuke hung heavy, its truth undeniable, and in that moment, the room seemed to tilt. The guests, who moments before had been engrossed in their wine and small talk, now turned fully, their attention drawn inexorably to the two men moving through the crowd. The tension wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was palpable, a living thing that pulsed through the room. Those who had come to clap politely from the sidelines, to nod at speeches and toast to corporate successes, began to sense they had overlooked something vital. Not just a man, but a message, one they hadn't been prepared to hear. Elijah Voss walked on, his steps steady, his expression unreadable. The crowd parted before him, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something instinctive, like water flowing around a stone in a riverbed. As he passed, whispers trailed in his wake, soft and reverent, carrying fragments of stories half-remembered. "Delta Force, wasn't it? Fallujah, I think." "No, didn't you hear? He was in Kandahar." The words weren't about medals or accolades. They were about a man who had walked away from this very room without protest, his pride untouched by the indignity of being turned away, and who was now being ushered back with the honor he deserved. For the first time that night, the ballroom no longer belonged to the donors in their tailored suits or the dignitaries with their practiced smiles. It belonged to Elijah Voss, a man whose quiet strength had rewritten the evening's narrative without uttering a word. On stage, beneath a soaring arch of velvet drapes and cascading ceiling lights, the corporate MC stood in his pristine tuxedo, his voice smooth and practiced as he read from the teleprompter. And of course, none of this evening's success would be possible without our generous partners in logistics, national defense initiatives, and the incredible team at Westbridge Systems, he said, his cadence polished from years of hosting banquets and fundraisers. He barely noticed the shift at the back of the room, the subtle ripple that began to disrupt the carefully choreographed event. At first, no one did, but as the murmurs grew, swelling like a tide, heads turned, conversations faltered, and the MC's rhythm broke. He glanced up, his eyes darting toward the disturbance, and for a fleeting moment, his confidence wavered. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could turn our attention," he began, but the words dissolved, unnecessary. No spotlight was needed. Every eye in the room had already found Elijah. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Unscripted and unplanned, the massive projection screen behind the stage, meant for sponsor logos and tribute montages, flickered to life. A technician backstage, monitoring the live feed, had recognized Elijah the moment he entered. Without waiting for instructions, acting on a gut instinct, he cued a file meant to play only at the night's close. The image that filled the screen was stark, black and white, grainy but unmistakable. A younger Elijah Voss stared out, his face streaked with soot, his uniform tattered and stained with the grit of battle. He carried a wounded soldier over one shoulder, his other hand gripping a rifle, his jaw set, his eyes steady and unyielding amidst the chaos of smoke and shattered concrete. The caption beneath it was simple, almost austere: Fallujah 2004. The silence that followed was absolute, a collective holding of breath that seemed to still the very heartbeat of the room. The MC stepped back from the microphone, his mouth agape, his polished demeanor crumbling under the weight of the moment. Sponsors at the front tables set down their wine glasses, their hands trembling slightly as the image sank in. Somewhere in the back, a woman let out a soft gasp, her hand rising to her mouth as if to stifle the sound. The photograph wasn't just a snapshot, it was a testament, a window into a moment of courage, so raw and unfiltered that it stripped away the evening's artifice. Elijah Voss stood at the center of it all, not seeking the attention, but commanding it nonetheless, his presence a quiet rebuke to the shallow pomp of the night. Inside, Elijah's mind was a storm of memories. The weight of that day in Fallujah pressed against him, not as a badge of honor, but as a burden he'd carried for decades. He could still feel the heat of the sun, the sting of smoke in his lungs, the ache in his arms as he carried his brother in arms through the rubble. He hadn't asked for this moment, this sudden spotlight. Yet here it was, pulling him back to a time he'd never fully left. His heart beat steadily, but there was a tightness in his chest, a flicker of unease at being seen so clearly by a room full of strangers. He didn't want their applause or their pity. He wanted only to be allowed to move through the world with the dignity he'd earned. General Braxton, too, felt the weight of the moment. His anger at the manager's oversight still simmered, but it was tempered by a fierce pride in the man beside him. He'd known Elijah for years, had seen the quiet strength that defined him, the way he carried his scars, both visible and hidden, with a grace most could only aspire to. Braxton's eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the guests, some awestruck, others ashamed, all of them grappling with the realization that they'd misjudged the man in the damp olive chair around them. He felt a pang of frustration, not just at the hotel staff, but at a world that so often failed to see what truly mattered. For the guests, the moment was a reckoning. They had come to network, to be seen, and to bask in the glow of their own generosity. But now, faced with Elijah's image on the screen, they felt the hollowness of their earlier indifference. A woman in a sequined gown clutched her husband's arm, her eyes glistening as she whispered, "How could we not have known?" A man at a nearby table, a corporate executive who'd been laughing moments before, stared at his plate, his appetite gone, a quiet shame settling over him. They hadn't just overlooked a man, they'd overlooked a truth, one that now stood before them, undeniable and humbling. The room remained still, the silence stretching, heavy with the unspoken. Elijah Voss stood at its center, not as a hero seeking acclaim, but as a man whose life had carved a path through fire and loss, and who had emerged with a quiet, unshakable dignity. The night was no longer about sponsors or speeches. It was about him and the truth he carried with him, a truth that had shifted the room's very foundation. The sound began with a single clap, sharp and solitary, echoing through the grand ballroom like a stone dropped into a still pond. Then another followed, and another, until the noise swelled into a powerful surge, a rolling thunder that seemed to rise from the very earth, as if carried from some distant battlefield where courage was forged in blood and sacrifice. This was no polite applause, no perfunctory gesture for a well-rehearsed speech or a pair of gleaming boots. This was something deeper, raw and unfiltered, a collective outpouring of recognition that had been held back too long, now breaking free with a force that shook the room. Every person in the ballroom rose to their feet, men and women in tailored suits and shimmering gowns, people who hadn't stood for a national anthem in years, now standing for one man, Elijah Voss. Elijah stood at the edge of the stage, his broad shoulders squared, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't smile or raise a hand to acknowledge the ovation. His eyes, sharp and steady, moved slowly across the sea of faces, taking in the crowd with a quiet intensity. There was pride in the way he stood, not the brash, chest-thumping kind, but something quieter, heavier, rooted in the weight of memory. It was the pride of a man who carried the names of the fallen in his heart, names etched not just in stone but in the marrow of his being, companions whose laughter and fears he still heard in the silence of his sleepless nights. Each clap seemed to stir something in him, not vanity, but a solemn acknowledgement of the moment, as if the sound wasn't for him alone but for those he represented, those who could no longer stand to hear it. Beside him, General Braxton leaned in, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of years of command. "It's your call now, Sergeant Major," he said, his words cutting through the roar of the crowd. "Take the stage or not, it's up to you." The general's eyes held a flicker of respect, not just for the man beside him, but for the choice he was about to make. For a moment, Elijah hesitated, his gaze lingering on the general, then drifting back to the crowd. His heart thudded in his chest, not with nerves, but with the gravity of what he was about to do. He wasn't here for glory, he never had been, but he felt the pull of duty, the same duty that had carried him through fire and loss, the duty to speak for those who no longer could. With a slow, deliberate step, Elijah moved forward. The crowd parted naturally, like a river making way for a stone, their applause softening into a reverent hush. No swelling music accompanied him. No dramatic fanfare marked his path. There was only the quiet rhythm of his boots against the polished floor and the weight of respect that cleared the way. He reached the center of the stage, where a lone microphone stood waiting, its metal gleaming faintly under the soft glow of the lights. Behind him, a glowing image lingered on the screen, a photograph of soldiers, their faces weathered but resolute, a reminder of the cost of service. Elijah glanced at it briefly, his throat tightening as memories surged, the smell of gunpowder, the crack of distant gunfire, the weight of a comrade's hand on his shoulder. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred, hands that had held rifles and dog tags and the weight of too many goodbyes. For a moment he was still, gathering himself, letting the room settle into a silence that felt almost sacred. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, deep, and unhurried, each word landing with the weight of truth. "I didn't come here tonight to be honored," he began, his tone quiet but commanding, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. "I came because I was asked to stand for those who aren't here to stand for themselves." The words hung in the air, simple but profound, and the room seemed to hold its breath, every syllable sinking into the hearts of those listening. Elijah's eyes moved across the crowd, not seeking approval, but searching for understanding. He thought of the men and women he'd served with, their faces vivid in his mind. Some laughing over cold coffee in the pre-dawn chill, others staring blankly at the horizon, their souls already half lost to the war. He spoke for them now, for the ones who never made it home, for the ones who did but carried invisible wounds that no metal could heal. "There are veterans sleeping under bridges right now," he continued, his voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. "Men and women who've shown more courage before breakfast than most people muster in a lifetime." He paused, letting the image settle in the minds of the audience. Tattered coats, cardboard signs, eyes that still held the fire of battles fought long ago. They're not always wearing suits or standing tall in a ceremony. Sometimes they're just standing in the rain, waiting to be seen. His words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They cut through the room like a blade, sharp and unyielding, forcing the crowd to confront a truth they'd too often ignored. Elijah's chest tightened as he spoke, not with anger, but with a deep, aching sorrow for those who'd been forgotten, their sacrifices reduced to footnotes in a world that moved on without them. The applause that followed wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning, a collective awakening, the sound of a room finally seeing what had been in front of them all along. It rose and fell slowly, reluctantly, as if the crowd wasn't ready to let go of the moment. Elijah stood at the edge of the stage, unmoved by the spotlight, his presence steady and unshaken. He didn't rush back to the microphone or bask in the ovation. Instead, he waited, letting the room settle not just into silence, but into a deeper kind of attention, the kind that demanded more than fleeting emotion. His heart was heavy with the weight of what he'd said, but also with a flicker of hope that his words might spark something real, something lasting. When the applause finally faded, Elijah stepped forward again, the soft lights above casting a gentle glow over his weathered face. He looked out at the crowd, polished, powerful, influential, men and women who shaped the world with their decisions. But his gaze seemed to pierce through them, as if he saw someone else entirely. Perhaps the ghosts of those he'd lost, or the faces of those still struggling in the shadows. "I didn't come here tonight to be honored," he repeated, his voice steady as ever, each word deliberate. "I came because someone asked me to speak, not for myself, but for the ones who aren't here to speak for themselves." He paused, the silence amplifying the weight of his words, the microphone catching the faint rustle of his breath. In that moment, he felt the presence of his fallen comrades, their voices urging him on, their stories demanding to be told. "Some men die once on a battlefield, in an ambush, in the line of duty," he said, his voice softening but no less powerful. "But some men, they die a little every day, when they're forgotten, when their names fade, when all that's left of their service is a form letter and a folded flag." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and a hush swept through the crowd. No glasses clinked, no side conversations murmured. The truth settled over the room like a heavy foam, undeniable and inescapable. Elijah's mind flickered to the families he'd visited, the mothers who clutched those folded flags as if they could hold their sons again, the children who grew up with only me without knowing why. The pain of those memories fueled his words, giving them an edge of raw, unspoken grief. "You say you honor service," he continued, his tone measured but piercing, his eyes scanning the crowd with a quiet intensity. "But too often we only honor what we can recognize. The uniform, the medals, the ceremony. Real respect, though, that comes before the uniform. It shows up when there's no crowd, when no one's watching." He shifted slightly, his gaze drifting to the back of the ballroom, where a young woman stood near the door, her face half hidden in the shadows. She'd greeted him earlier, her smile polite but distant, unaware of who he was. "That young woman at the door didn't know who I was," he said, his voice steady, almost gentle. "That's all right, I didn't tell her. But the way she treated me, that said more than any speech you'll hear tonight, not because she made a mistake, but because she didn't think it mattered." His words were not an accusation but a quiet challenge, laid out with the simplicity of a man who'd seen too much to waste breath on pretense. He thought of the countless veterans he'd met, their stories untold because no one thought to ask, their worth measured not by medals but by the quiet dignity they carried through their struggles. "Respect isn't a reaction," he said, his voice firm but not harsh, each word like a stone carefully placed in a memorial wall. "It's a principle. It's how we see someone when we don't yet know their story." A few heads in the crowd bowed, not in shame but in reflection, their thoughts turning inward, perhaps to moments they'd overlooked someone's worth, moments they'd failed to see the invisible scars of service. Elijah's heart ached as he spoke, not for himself but for the countless others who'd been reduced to stereotypes or statistics, their humanity buried under the weight of society's indifference. Yet, in that ache, there was also a quiet resolve, a belief that his words might plant a seed, might stir the crowd to look beyond the surface, to see the person beneath the tattered coat or the tired eyes. His eyes lingered on the crowd, searching for a spark of understanding, a sign that his words had reached them. He didn't need their applause, didn't want their pity. He wanted their action, their commitment to see the unseen, to honor the forgotten, not with ceremonies but with compassion. As he stepped back from the microphone, the room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling into the hearts of those who listened. Then slowly the applause rose again, not as a performance but as a promise to do better, to see more, to honor not just the service but the human beings who gave it. Elijah Voss stood at the edge of the room, his eyes slowly tracing the faces in the crowd. His gaze wasn't one of judgment, but of quiet observation, searching for those who lingered in the shadows of recognition. He sought the ones who slipped through the cracks of celebration, the veterans who never made it into the glossy photo montages or sat at the polished head tables. These were the souls who carried the weight of their service in silence, etched into their posture, their eyes, their unspoken stories. They didn't crave the spotlight or the clink of champagne glasses. They yearned only for someone to see them, truly see them, for who they were and what they'd given. Elijah's heart stirred with a mix of resolve and sorrow, knowing that their burdens were often heavier than any metal could ever be. Stepping back from the podium, his fingers brushed the cool wood, grounding him in the moment. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer, almost fragile, as if he were sharing a secret with the room. "This night isn't about me," he said, his words carrying a humility that felt like a warm hand on a weary shoulder. "It's about remembering what service truly means, not the kind that's applauded, but the kind that's lived. It's about who we are when we forget to honor those who've given everything." His eyes flickered with memories he didn't share, memories of dust and gunfire, of choices made in the chaos of war that still haunted his quieter moments. With a single nod to General Braxton, Elijah turned and walked away from the microphone, his steps deliberate, unhurried. He didn't linger for the crowd's reaction, didn't expect it. But the applause came anyway, not a sudden roar, but a slow, swelling tide, authentic and earned. It was the kind of sound that pulled people to their feet, not because that they felt obligated, but because something in Elijah's words had touched a nerve, a truth they hadn't realized they'd been ignoring. In those 5 minutes, Elijah hadn't just reintroduced himself to the room. He'd held up a mirror, reminding them of the people they aspired to be, the values they'd let slip in the glitter of the gala. The evening didn't end with the usual fanfare, no celebrity monologues or effervescent toasts. Instead, it closed on a quieter, more profound note. Small groups formed in the corners of the ballroom, their voices low, their handshakes heavy with emotion. Tears glistened in the eyes of some as they approached Elijah, not for a photo or a soundbite, but for a moment of connection. They thanked him for his words, for his presence, for embodying a dignity that felt both rare and achingly familiar. Each conversation was a thread, weaving a tapestry of gratitude and reflection that lingered long after the lights dimmed. By 9 a.m. the next morning, the Belmont Grand Hotel had done something unprecedented. They issued a statement that went beyond a mere apology for the oversight that had left Elijah standing in the rain. It was a commitment, a vow to change. They announced Operation Frontline Respect, a mandatory training program for every employee, from bellhops to executives. Led by veterans, the initiative would teach the art of noticing, the subtle cues of service, the quiet strength in a veteran's stance, the patience in their silence. The press release captured it perfectly. Service isn't always found in medals. It's in the way someone carries themselves, in their endurance, in the spaces where words aren't needed. Surprisingly, the young hostess and the security guard who had escorted Elijah out weren't fired, despite General Braxton's initial fury. Elijah, ever steady, ever compassionate, had intervened. 2 days after the gala, he made a private call to the hotel director, his voice calm but firm. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much to believe in permanent condemnation. "I got one once in Fallujah when the order came to leave men behind, and I couldn't do it." The memory lingered in his pause, a wound still tender after all these years. Instead of punishment, he proposed a path forward. Refer the hostess and guard to a veteran transition center run by his old friend, Theo Marshall, a retired corpsman. The center offered rigorous training in veteran support, trauma awareness, and professional service. At first, the two accepted out of guilt, their heads bowed under the weight of their mistake. But over time, gratitude replaced shame, and they embraced the opportunity to learn, to grow, to make amends. 6 months later, they returned to the Belmont, not as employees, but as guest instructors for the hotel's new national initiative, Honor Without Uniform. What had begun as one man's quiet stand in the rain had sparked a movement. Hotels across the country took notice, adopting similar programs. Some created hiring pipelines for veterans, while others stripped away VIP labels from certain events, opening their doors to former service members of all ranks and backgrounds, whether they wore suits or carried no medals at all. The gala itself was transformed. Its name changed from Valor Night to Honor Without Uniform, a tribute to both the seen and unseen heroes. The following year, the event expanded, held simultaneously in 3 cities and live-streamed nationwide. This time, the first guests welcomed at the door weren't the celebrities or the donors with their glittering attire. They were the veterans who had RSVP'd without titles or fanfare, their presence a quiet testament to their service. Elijah was there, of course, but not on the stage, not even near it. He stood at the back of the room beside the janitor who had made the call that night, the one who'd seen him in the rain and acted. They exchanged few words, their silence comfortable, their shared understanding deeper than any speech could convey. The work was speaking now, its ripples spreading far beyond that single night, and the world was finally beginning to listen. 6 months later, the rain had long since evaporated. The applause faded into a distant memory. Elijah Voss had returned to his quiet life, content to let the movement carry on without him. But the change he'd sparked endured, woven into the fabric of countless lives, a reminder that true honor doesn't need a uniform or a spotlight to shine. Every morning, Elijah Voss followed the same rhythm, a quiet cadence that shaped his days. He'd rise early, lace up his worn boots, and step out into the dawn for a walk through the neighborhood, where the air carried the scent of dew and freshly cut grass. Back home, he'd unfold the newspaper, its pages crinkling under his calloused fingers, scanning headlines that often felt distant from his own world. His garden demanded his attention next, weeds sprouting stubbornly between the roses he'd planted decades ago, each one a small act of defiance against time's relentless march. Elijah didn't chase accolades or invitations. His life was a steady hum of solitude and purpose, content in its simplicity. But one afternoon, a sharp knock at his door broke the familiar quiet, stirring something deep within him, a flicker of curiosity perhaps, or the faint weight of anticipation. Standing on his porch was a woman, her blazer crisp but her boots scuffed with the kind of wear that spoke of discipline and grit. She introduced herself as Claire Jennings, the new director of veteran relations at the Belmont Group. A former Marine, her eyes held a sharpness honed by years of service, yet there was a warmth in her voice, a softness that seemed to emerge from battles fought and lessons learned. She carried no airs, no pretension, only an envelope she extended with steady hands. "We're doing things differently this time," she said, her tone earnest, almost confiding. "No grand ceremonies, no fancy galas, just real talk. Real impact." Elijah took the envelope, his fingers brushing the paper as he opened it. Inside was a card, its words simple but weighty. Honor Without Uniform Community Forum on Homeless Veterans, Mental Health and Service After Service. Your insight matters. Please advise us. He looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "Advising?" he asked, his voice low, testing the word as if it belonged to someone else. Claire nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We're not asking you to show up and clap, Elijah. We're asking you to lead, to guide us." A week later, Elijah Voss returned to the Belmont Grand, a place that once turned him away, its grand facade looming like a memory of rejection. This time, he didn't slip through the service entrance, nor did he stand in the rain, shoulders hunched against the cold. Instead, he was met at the main doors by a line of volunteers, their faces a mix of resolve and quiet pride. Half were veterans like him, their postures carrying the unmistakable weight of service. The others were civilians, trained to see what most ignored, the invisible scars, the unspoken stories. Inside, the grand ballroom had been transformed. Gone were the chandelier's glitz and the banquet table's polish. In their place stood rows of folding chairs, arranged in a circle that invited conversation rather than spectacle. Along the walls, backpacks were neatly stacked, each one stuffed with essentials: hygiene kits, warm jackets, sturdy boots. A pop-up clinic hummed quietly near the buffet, offering flu shots, PTSD counseling, and help navigating the labyrinth of VA claims. The room buzzed with people, but not the kind you'd find in gala photos. These were veterans on the edge of society, some without a place to call home, others with hands that trembled from unseen battles, and a few who simply seemed lost, their eyes searching for something to anchor them. Elijah felt a pang in his chest, a mix of recognition and sorrow. He knew those looks, those silences. He'd lived them once, standing outside in the rain, unseen by the world rushing past. But here in this room they were seen. Not pitied, not judged, just seen. At the front of one breakout session stood two faces Elijah recognized. The young hostess who once averted her eyes when he lingered too long in the hotel lobby, and the security guard who'd ushered him out with a firm but polite hand. Now they stood side by side leading a workshop called Recognition Without Assumptions, How to Greet with Dignity. They had completed the Veterity Center's program, stayed on as mentors, and now traveled across 3 states, training others to see beyond snap judgments. Their voices were steady but humble, their stories raw with honesty. When they spoke of their past mistake, turning Elijah away, they didn't flinch or make excuses. Instead, they leaned into it, sharing how that moment reshaped them, how it taught them to pause, to question, to listen. Elijah watched them, a quiet pride swelling in his chest, though he'd never admit it. He felt the weight of their growth, the ripple of change that had started with a single, overlooked moment. During a lull near the exit, a small group approached him. They were former soldiers, men and women whose shoulders still bore the invisible burden of war, grief, guilt, memories that no amount of time could erase. One young man, clutching a worn duffel bag, his eyes sunken and wary, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone cared," he said, his words heavy with disbelief, as if kindness were a foreign language. Elijah met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "We do now," he replied, his voice soft but firm, carrying the weight of someone who'd waited too long to hear those words himself. The young man nodded, his shoulders easing just a fraction, as if Elijah's words had lifted a small piece of the load he carried. As the evening drew to a close, the volunteers began packing up, the fluorescent lights casting a stark glow over the room. Someone approached Elijah, a clipboard in hand, asking if he had a quote for the program, something to capture the night's meaning. He paused, his mind sifting through years of quiet observations, moments of being overlooked, in the rare instances when someone truly saw him. "Respect doesn't need a uniform," he said finally, his voice low but clear. "But it notices who gives it." He handed them the quote, shook their hand, and walked out the same door he'd once stood outside, no longer invisible. His steps were steady, purposeful, but his heart carried a quiet ache, not for himself, but for those still waiting to be seen. Elijah hadn't returned for recognition or applause. He'd come back to ensure no one else stood in the rain, unnoticed, unvalued. In a world that often measures worth by appearances, by titles, wealth, or the shine of a uniform, Elijah Voss's story cuts through the noise. His dignity wasn't worn on his sleeve or pinned to his chest. It was lived quietly in every step he took, every weed he pulled, every moment he stood tall, despite being overlooked. He never demanded honor, never raised his voice to be heard. Yet in his silence, in the way he carried himself through years of being unseen, he revealed a strength that no medal could match. His life was a testament to resilience, a reminder that true worth doesn't shout, it endures. And when the world finally turned its gaze toward him, it wasn't because of grand speeches or bold gestures. It was because of the quiet, unshakable way he lived, a beacon for others to follow. There's a lesson here, one that lingers like the echo of footsteps in an empty hall. In our rush through life, how often do we glance past the elderly man in the grocery aisle, his hands trembling as he reaches for a can? How often do we miss the woman sitting alone in the cafe, her eyes tracing stories we'll never know? What sacrifices, what struggles are we walking by without a second thought? And when no one's watching, when the world isn't applauding, do we still choose respect? Elijah's story asks us to pause, to look closer, to see the quiet heroes among us, because sometimes the loudest truths are spoken in silence.